Today we are pleased to present Aperture Live on the Direct Gaze, featuring artist Deana Lawson, represented by Rona Hoffman Gallery, and director of the Pérez Art Museum Miami, Franklin Sirmans. The panel is moderated by managing editor of Aperture Magazine, Brendan Wattenberg. Please join us in welcoming our panelists.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Brendan, and it's a pleasure to be here with Deana and Franklin, and we thank you for joining us. It's really an honor to share the stage with these two figures who are really inspiring and important to contemporary art, contemporary culture today. Franklin, who is really a path-breaking curator who's influenced audiences from New York to Houston to LA and now in Miami. And Deana, who has really given the world a collection of exquisite, masterful, sometimes shockingly beautiful photographs. I think Deana is one of the most intriguing photographers of her generation. Her images defy multiple interpretations, which is one of their many strengths. They're rooted in our culture. They're responding to our concerns today, but they really possess a wisdom about their own future relevance. These are photographs that are meant to last. So earlier this year, Deana and I began working together on what will become her first monograph, which will be published by Aperture in fall of 2017. There's a lot riding on an artist's first book. The first book is always a point of departure. It's the first statement and the first projection of an artist's vision into the future, which is to say we have to make a book that's of our time, that's responding to our moment in the culture, but we have to look ahead and ask, how is this book going to be read in 10 years, in 20 years? So an artist's first book is really a bid for her legacy. So hope you're ready for this. When Deana and I had a workshop together in April to begin selecting images for her book, I divided a stack of pictures into two categories, one being my choice for what would eventually make it into the book, and another one to consider, to think about. And Deana eyed my A list and my B list with some amusement, and eventually pulled one from the B list. I should say, there's no B list when it comes to Deana Lawson, but we're not making a catalog raisonné, so not everything can go in. We have to make some choices, okay? So Deana pulled one of the other images, and she said, this is a classic Deana Lawson image. And I began to think, oh, well, what is a classic Deana Lawson image? I think a classic Deana Lawson image is one that couldn't have been taken by anyone else. It's an image that combines a mastery of pose, lighting, mood, and setting, and often portrays the subject's direct gaze. And so I just want to show you, as we start, a few spreads from the preliminary design of Deana's book. These are a few pages here. So that's what we're here to discuss today, the direct gaze. Not only the direct gaze in Deana's work, but also in the work of the artists who have influenced her, and also how the direct gaze and contemporary photography at large has influenced Franklin's work as a curator and now as a museum director. So I think, Deana, maybe we can start with talking about some of the artists who are in your constellation of influence, who've informed your vision and your ideas about photography. And when Deana, as some of you may know, first kind of came to a lot of attention in 2011 as part of MoMA's new photography exhibition. And at that time, she gave an interview and said that two of her influences and maybe reasons why she wanted to become a photographer were the work of Carrie Mae Weems and Renee Cox, among others. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your first influences in photography, and we can go through some of these images.
Sure. Just to give you a general brief background, I'm originally from Rochester, New York, and I come from a working class family, and I didn't have the intention to become an artist when I went to undergrad. I actually went to school for international business. And during my sophomore year, I decided that I wanted to go into the arts, but still didn't know if it was photography. And I remember once I found photography, the work of Deana Lawson just psychologically played on my mind. And in that class, in Photography 1, I asked my teacher if she knew of any black artists that I could look up so I can make a presentation. And she was like, well, actually, yeah, Carrie Mae Weems, and I think Lorna Simpson might be her name. And so when I came across this work in the library, I remember it distinctly, because at the time I also had discovered Nina Simone's music as well. But I just remember being in the library and like flipping through and looking at the kitchen table series and seeing how this beautiful black woman was given voice to, you know, particular relationships, about love, about sisterhood, about family. And I just felt like that was just extremely powerful. So, and on top of that, actually, if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, sure. But I might just ask Franklin, I think you said that you actually came to know about Deana's work through Carrie Mae Weems. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, thinking at this image now, it's hard to think back. And Deana, you can remind me, but it was a while ago. You know, I think I was writing, and I was probably just in Houston. And Carrie probably told Jeff, her partner, Jeff Hoon, who did Contact Sheet. Right. And that was at University of Rochester or Syracuse?
Syracuse University, Lightwork.
Right.
And you were a resident at Lightwork, is that right? Yeah.
And so I got these images to write about before we ever met and before we had ever really spoken. And it's the same thing today, like walking around the corner of Rona's gallery is just, there's just this jaw-dropping kind of moment where you're looking at something that you haven't seen before. And it's so interesting to hear you mention Arbus today. I mean, I was trying to think back about some historical kind of moments that might bring me to some sort of way of talking about your work. And of course, she comes up, and there are others, or, you know, we get to. But really, it was unsurprising in a way that Carrie Mae would be the person to introduce me to somebody whose work is so incredibly profound and who also works in a photographic medium. I consider her to be very much a kind of mentor and a partner in that conversation. And so I'm just grateful for that opportunity so many years ago. And to be able to watch the work and to see the exhibition at the Art Institute last year has been a phenomenal experience. So I'm just really happy to be up here with you.
Cool. Likewise. This is the image by Renee Cox.
Right. And I guess going back to undergrad experience, again, I remember being in the bathroom and someone had made an installation of photographs. And this is one of the pictures I saw in the woman's bathroom. And I was like, wow, like, look at this woman, like, the way that she's standing, her pose. And pose is everything with my work. Like, a photograph could be made or broken just by a slight pose. So to me, like, the pose, the fact that she's wearing heels, and she had a baby. I have 2 kids, so to me, you know, being a mother, like, that was just so powerful. So that was just another sort of image that kind of played in my mind.
And there's an interesting backstory to this image, which you may know. Renee Cox is featured in the next issue of Aperture, which comes out in November. She gives a very candid interview, as is her style. And she said she made this image shortly after she enrolled in the Whitney's independent study program. And she learned that she was pregnant. And some of the other students said, "What are you going to do?" And she said, "What do you mean, what am I going to do?" And then she said, "I'm going to give you motherhood in your face." And that's how
that sounds like
this,
her.
that's,
Yes.
If you know Renee Cox, that's totally par for the course. She does that in the position, looking down in this very regal manner. I mean, not only the heels, but the gaze. It's extremely powerful picture about motherhood and feminine power. So I'm glad you brought this one into the conversation.
And of course, Kara Walker. I have a friend, colleague of mine, Kenya Robinson, and I remember we were talking about when we first encountered Kara Walker's work. She said that when she saw the book, she Xerox copied every page of the book from the library and went home. And that's similar to the experience I had. I feel like Kara Walker was the first artist for me to give me permission to transgress if I wanted to, and to be a little bit naughty. So that would be Kara Walker. And then, I wanted to just pull in other images that I felt were a bit unexpected in terms of the artists that inform my work. This is Otto Dix, who was making paintings during the Weimar Republic in Germany. And I was really interested in the subjects that he was drawn to and the way that he represented the psyche of this particular time period between World War I and World War II in Germany. This sort of like, I guess you could describe it as almost like a post-apocalyptic sort of environment. And he would choose like soldiers and prostitutes and different women to paint, and he would often, I guess, exaggerate maybe the flaws. And in my work, I guess one thing I don't turn away from is the flaws of the body, because I actually find that to be a part of the beauty that I want to explore. So.
I was very surprised to see this image when Deana sent it to me, very unexpected. But I'm not surprised now because the expression of power and vulnerability and the owning, the self-possession of the female character is just totally a kind of Deana Lawson style. So I'm glad you brought this one in as well.
And then Jacob Holt, who I think one of the biggest questions I get asked often when I'm doing a talk is access. Like, how do I get people to disarm themselves in front of the camera? And I think looking at Jacob Holt's work, he was someone from Denmark who would hitchhike across the country. And in this particular picture called Love in Philadelphia, he lived with this young woman and her mother for like 4 years. And she wanted to go hitchhiking with him for a couple years, and she went across the country with him. And when she got back home, she was so excited to see the love of her life, her boyfriend. And she had known Jacob Holt for this amount of time, that when they had this moment of embracing and sharing love, they were completely oblivious almost to the camera being present. And I actually admire, like I said, try in my work to take away the camera, not let that be, get in the way of me engaging with the subject.
But how did you first learn about Jacob's work, actually?
How did I learn about his work? I forget how. I'm not sure. Why?
Well, it just strikes me as that the background is kind of, I think Deana's work, there's a lot of subtle detail, and if you see her work on view here at the fair at Rona's gallery, it's one of the reasons I assume that you make very big prints is because of the extreme attention to detail, and I think that the double crosses
Right.
and the background, there's a very dramatic setting in the kind of mood of Christianity over this image.
For sure. And I guess one more thing I should say about Jacob Holt's work is that his work almost reminds me of vernacular images or family album images. And I would say that's really my first love of photography, like looking at the albums my father and my mother would make, these leather-bound, books that were, you peel the plastic back and the glue gets old and brown, and like I just love that, and to see life past, people get older or people have passed away, like all of this material in vernacular images inspires my work. So the environment and how it's almost like a snapshot aesthetic plays into it as well. So.
And Chris O'Feely, of course.
Yeah, the reason why I put up Chris O'Feely's work is one of the images I was going to talk about is the garden. But I saw this image, Black Grapes, and I just love this series of paintings that Chris O'Feely did of painted in red, black, and green, which is the Pan-African colors, like the Black nationalist colors. But also, too, what struck me is this sort of enchantment or this like paradise of romance of Black love, and I just really engaged with that painting. So.
But Chris O'Feely is also a very interesting character, I think, in comparison to you, because he's someone who has been really thinking about African diaspora in the larger theme of his work. I mean,
For sure.
He's worked in Southern Africa. He lives in Trinidad now, and I think the mythologies of the diaspora are present in his work from the very beginning. I see that also.
For sure.
In your work, yeah.
I mean, I'm going to talk about how I've traveled to DR Congo, Haiti, Jamaica, going to countries that somewhat touch upon the African diaspora. So that it's definitely connected to that as well. Thank you for bringing that up. Yep.
So now we'll take some time to look at a few of Deana's images in depth. And I think, I didn't want to show 100 slides and we're all at a fair where you are just sort of overwhelmed by imagery. But Deana's work rewards looking and re-looking and a slow looking. So we're going to kind of break down a few images to talk about Deana's process and her theme. And I think there's no better one to start with than this image, which is called The Garden. It's currently on view at the Whitney in New York in Human Interest, which is paintings, photographs, and sculptures from the permanent collection of the Whitney. And I happened to visit the exhibition a few weeks ago, and I was amazed to see how many people were flocked around this picture like moths. And there was a lot of curiosity. There was a lot of intense looking. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how this picture came to be and what you're working with here?
So I think I always had this sort of longing to go back to, I would say, Africa generally, but it's almost like, I would say, like a romantic nostalgia, so to speak. Again, I'm from a working class environment in Rochester, New York, so when I told my parents that I wanted to go to DR Congo, they're like, what the heck are you doing? Like, this girl is so crazy. But also, too, like, I grew up looking at films like Coming to America and, like, kind of how, the Black American imagination of Coming to America, you see, like, zebras running across the screen or, like, princesses. And, like, I just love that whole thing. But I think looking at DR Congo and artists and photojournalists who've gone to that particular part of the country, I felt like it was constantly being represented in a state of crisis or, like, problematic state. And I guess I wanted to think about how I might look at this place if I had the opportunity to go as a Black American female versus, as another foreigner. And so I thought about it for a while, and I looked at the work of Richard Moss, and I was really struck by it. There was a lot of tension, I felt like, in terms of how he depicted it with infrared color, but also it was really beautiful. But at the same time, I had certain strong convictions that put me against the work. And so I thought about that, and then I even asked him, I'm like, well, what would happen if I wanted to go to DR Congo? Like, I wonder how I could get access. And he told me that I would have to probably pretend as though I was a nun, just because of everything. I was like, wow. So that was the first thing that frightened me from even going. And then,
did you actually pretend to be a nun?
No, that wasn't my narrative for DR Congo. And then I had a good friend who is named Nikisha Hobbs, and she's a friend I met back in Chicago, actually, I would say 10 years ago, and we were undergraduates. And I happened to reach out to her on Facebook, and we reconnected, and she said she was on the way to the Congo with her school. And I know her school was made up of 3rd and 4th graders. And I'm just thinking, like, what? You're going to wait, is she talking about Congo, or is this like another like city in America somewhere called the Congo that I don't know about? And I'm like, are you talking about like DR Congo? And she said, yes, girl, I'm going to DR Congo. I'm gonna call you when I get back. And I was like, what? I was like, okay, bet. So she went, and she came back, and she said, girl, you would never believe the experience. It was amazingly beautiful. And I'm like, okay, I'm flying to Chicago. I want to hear about this story because I want to go to DR Congo. So I actually flew to Chicago, and we met over drinks. And she said that when she was in DR Congo, the way that the woman made the cassava leaves tasted like the way that her mom made collard greens. And I was like, wow, like that memory is so deep, like in the DNA. And then she said, when they had a welcoming circle, the woman, they had a drumming circle, and it was dancing, and they all went in a circle and they started dancing. Keep in mind that this is a predominantly African-American group who went over. So when the woman saw them dancing, they started screaming and falling out, and Nikisha and her family didn't understand why. And apparently they were so shocked that Nikisha and them danced like them. So before, they had only experienced foreigners who were not African American, but who were like European or, white American or what have you. So they were just shocked that, like, wow, they dance like us. So when she just told me those things, and she just said, it was beautiful, and I could connect you with the person who brought me over, and I was just like, all right, I could actually do this. And so that's how it happened, like in a very organic fashion. Her contact who worked at the school, and actually I would say just in general, when I travel, it usually is through a personal connect. I know a lot of photographers who work in photojournalism. It's often like a fixer sort of relationship where you pay the fixer and they go out and run to find you. It wasn't that sort of relationship. It was like this. And so even with that said, though, I don't know how much time I have to talk about this.
Yeah,
'Cause
no,
I could
let's just,
talk a long
well,
time.
maybe you could tell us a little bit about this image. Did you have this image in mind before you, I know you
Okay,
kind of
so I'll
have
fast
some
forward it.
images
Yeah.
in mind before you make them. Was this
Right.
one that you were thinking about?
So oftentimes I might have my partner draw a picture, and I'll dictate to him what exactly I want, and I'll use that as my blueprint to show the subjects. With this particular image, I was looking at a painter, Hieronymus Bosch, who did the Garden of Earthly Delights. He is just, his mind is just ill. Like, it's just amazing the way he depicts the heavenly, the celestial realm, and the hellish realm. But in the heavenly realm, there's this one bubble and this couple, and they're posed similar to this. And I just located that particular scene. I copied it, and I brought that to DR Congo with me. And when I began to look for the subjects, everyone I was looking for, I said, this is what I want to do, particularly because I knew that the photograph was going to be nude, and nudity is not, nudity is a way of life. People bathe in the river and so forth, but to take a picture nude, like, that's just not, like, no, the norm. So I really felt like I had to have a reference image so people knew what I wanted to do.
Do you want to tell us who the subjects are?
Sure. The female subject is a woman who I met at a restaurant in DR Congo. She was a bartender, waitress. And the male subject was my moto driver. And that didn't happen until the last minute just because I didn't know who we would get for the Adam figure. And I said, why not just the taxi driver? And I remember Daniel, who helped me work, who was translating for me. I just saw him walk over to Ntoto, who is his name, and they talked. And I just saw Ntoto nod his head like, okay. I was like, all right, let's do it. So.
And in this picture, I feel you've recast, obviously, the origin moment and in the place from which we all come anyway. And it's kind of a startling picture. And from one startling picture to another, also concerning the African diaspora, this picture is made in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, is that right?
Yes.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about how this picture came to be? I should say, the first time I met Deana at a studio visit, I saw this picture and I was kind of blown away. If you see the print of it, the shades of the red and blue are pretty much breathtaking. And then there's a story as well. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Earlier I mentioned how Nikisha said that the way that the woman cooked their collard greens and the way, the dance was similar. And going back, thinking about that, like, genetic memory or this kind of sort of mythological memory, a friend of mine mentioned that how during the transatlantic slave trade, we couldn't bring anything with us. We couldn't bring our art, our artifacts and so forth. So the only creative thing we could bring was our bodies, our spirit, our spirituality. And so I really wanted to think about spirituality in my work and the aesthetics of that and, how that represents power. And so I went to Haiti and I went to a voodoo ceremony for Urzuli Danto. And for this particular spirit, Urzuli Danto is said to be the mother of Haiti. During the revolution, the community called upon Urzuli Danto, and her animal is the black pig, and her colors are blue and red. So I went to one ceremony. One other thing I should mention is I'm definitely an admirer of Zora Neale Hurston, who's also gone to certain locations like Haiti and Jamaica, and who is also interested in voodoo, and I read her travelogue. So I think that certainly inspired the work.
And Maya Deren as well?
And Maya Deren, yes. Go Tell My Horse, correct. And so when I went to Haiti the first time, I witnessed the ceremony, and I had my camera with me. And 3 pigs were being sacrificed, and I was actually a bit like afraid because, you know, it's one thing to think about this conceptually in the safe, you know, in New York City in my studio, but it's another thing to be like at a voodoo ceremony and not speak patois, not speak French. So I kind of didn't know like what was happening, but at the same time I really wanted to engage. And so I remember the first head of the pig was cut, and a woman picked up the head of the pig and put it on her head and marched around, and her eyes were wide because the spirit had mounted her. And I thought it was so powerful, like the way she put the head of the pig on her and marched around. But I stood back and I photographed it from afar. I came back home to New York, looked at my negatives, and it was far away, it was out of focus. And I'm like, damn, like I, totally missed that moment. And it just sat with me, and I said, I think I have to go back. I need to go back. I need to try to stage this for real. And so a year passed, and finally, I asked a friend of mine, Henry Taylor, the painter, if he wanted to go to Haiti with me, and he said, yeah. So I'm like, all right. And the day before my plane left, my partner, who usually sketches out my ideas, I asked him if he would draw a woman with the head of a pig on her, and he looked at me like, you really think you about to take this picture? I'm like, I don't know, but just draw it. And so he drew the picture, and I came to Haiti, and I met with Claude, who is a friend of mine who helped me to achieve the photograph. But I remember our first meeting at the bar, I showed him the picture and told him what I wanted to do, and he just sort of ignored me. And I was like, I really want to try to make this picture. And I think this is probably one of the most difficult pictures I've ever made because, like it's real. Like, we actually almost created somewhat like a ceremony for a photograph. I have my lights and my large format camera. There's the head of a pig being cut off and squealing, and the noise is excruciating, and it's a powerful animal. 5 people have to hold it down. I didn't know if it was gonna get loose and knock down my camera and the lights. Like, it was real. So, this is also one of the times where I could not pick the subject of the photograph. The subject was chosen for me. So I didn't know what she was gonna look like until I got there.
But it's amazing you were allowed such intimate access to very private
Definitely.
ceremonies. So
I'm blessed for sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
This picture is called Baby Sleep, a classic Deana Lawson image if there ever was one. Maybe with this picture you can tell us just a little bit about your process, technically speaking. I think of Deana as a kind of theatrical director. She's a casting director. She picks the clothing and the material setting with the utmost precision. And I think that some of the settings look familiar, but always a little bit strange and have some theatrical element to them. So maybe you can just tell us technically how you kind of make these pictures, because this is a setting that you typically use across many pictures, not this actual place, but these domestic interiors.
Okay, so I met Thais in my neighborhood in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and I already knew that I wanted to take a photograph of a family, and I wanted the female to exhibit like a high-end sexuality, erotic sort of feel to it. And so when I saw Thais and her husband and her baby on Malcolm X Boulevard, I said, she is the one that could probably do this. So I went up to her and I said, I think you have an amazing look. I would love to photograph you for this project. And she was like, okay, So she gave me her number and I called her. And I was actually nervous because sometimes husbands can say like, I don't want my wife to pose, and da-da-da-da. So I was actually really nervous when I met with them. And but luckily, Greg, he was open to it, her husband. So their apartment was really small, and we decided to photograph this in my apartment in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. I remember that day, Zion is the baby's name. Zion was sick, he had a cold. I remember he like spit up and threw up. And ideally, the baby would have been awake in the picture, but he was so sick he fell asleep. But I'm actually glad because he should be asleep because his baby sleep. And like if you have a family and like sometimes you have to wait for the baby to go to sleep. But on a more technical level, like on a formal level, usually I photograph with a large format camera or a medium format camera. I have 2 lights set up, so it's almost as if I'm bringing a light studio to a location. And yeah,
when we talk about the direct gaze, this is a fantastic example of power and vulnerability combined into one
Yeah,
atmosphere, and also I think heightened by the spilling toys and the trail of the other details of life that have to be present. Yeah.
And I guess one last thing I want to say, it was to me also about female power, which, you know, some feminists might be like, oh, you're like it's kind of stereotypical, like sexual power. But to me, it was just like, you know, as a black female, like where often when I grew up, you didn't really see black women in institutional power. But that didn't mean that we didn't have power in our private life, you know, whether it be at church or in our domestic space. So to me, this is about another sort of power.
We'll look at one more.
This is Otisha, and it was photographed in Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica. And she is a dancer, and towards the end of the photo shoot, I guess the challenge is, you know, when you're photographing for years, similar content, you try to figure out how can you make this new again within the rectangle. You know, how can you rearrange the body, like the domestic scene, so it seems fresh. And I pose so many women on couches, and I'm just like, how can I use the couch again in a new figure? And I guess I felt like towards the end, when we exhausted all the other poses, I wanted there to be a certain tension in the body. And that's when I asked her to do this particular pose. But, you know, the tiger rug, my parents have that tiger velvet painting in their basement. The plastic, my mom had plastic on her couch for all during the 90s. And, you know, the fake plants. And I guess it's somewhat of like this lush domestic space that I felt was also in the landscape as well in Jamaica.
But it's another example, I think, of you combining all of your references from home, from your upbringing, also with your concern for the African diaspora, and this is taken in Jamaica, and it just kind of is you have even the plants refer back to some of the other images from Congo, from, you know, elsewhere, where you have a lush atmosphere. Here it's just peeking in from the side. Well, now I think we'll just turn this to Franklin and talk a little bit about Franklin's work with photography as a curator and now as a museum director. I'll just give you this clicker here.
Thank you.
But maybe just to start, you could tell us a little bit about the photographers that have influenced you, your scholarship, and your work as a curator over the years.
I mean, you know, the interesting thing is, I guess I come into organizing exhibitions at a point where that conversation, you know, has turned. So I don't think about it so much in the sense of this is a photograph and how does it play as a photograph, as much as I think of it as this is a work of art. And so for the most part, you know, if I think through exhibitions, that's tended to be the way that I look at it. I'm gonna show a couple. Let's see. Okay, so for the sake of time, there are, I'm going to run through a couple of images here. And what I was going to say was, so I did one exhibition that was specifically photographically based. And it was at the Manil Collection in 2007. And I think that, you know, rightly or wrongly, we were, at that moment, you're thinking about Facebook, and you're thinking about technology, and you're thinking about hypertextual images, and you know, so at that time it was like, how do you display that? And I guess the best way to display that in a static art gallery is to use a lot of images in a singular space. And so at PAM, this is an exhibition that I did not work on, but this is an exhibition we had that opened the museum. So it was a way of saying photography is important here. Our collection has about 1,800 works in it, and 200, almost 200 of them are photographs. And in part, this is because of our foundation, and there is a big gift that came from Charles Coles, and it included a range of photographs over the last, I don't know, 100 years. So you're seeing a couple of images from there. And of course, it was called Image Search. So right in the title, you know this has something to do with like Google and something like that, or at least making that suggestion. And there are a range of things in here, obviously. Let's just... Yeah, to give you that sense of, okay, salon style, things are coming at you from every different angle. Predominantly portraiture. So you get the sense. Lorna Simpson, I had to throw that in there. This is a work that's in the collection, and I've, can't help but think about her, and we've seen a lot of the work here in the last few days. Immensely important, and reminds me also of that moment. So, I think I'm a little bit older, but there was, I guess, if I think about my entrance into Deana's work, I have to also think about Lorna and Carrie Mae, obviously, and Renee, but then also some other artists who were working particularly with text and working with a way of making images that Kelly Jones talked about a lot in terms of a photo text kind of movement. And I think in many ways, some of them felt like at that time, in order to bring forward the concepts that were in the work, they needed the text there as well. And I think that's interesting. I don't think we see that right now. This is an image that I look at every single day. It's an image that is on the wall right next to my elevator as I walk out of the apartment. And, it's a classic Carrie Mae. It's one of the few images that is of a male figure and of a male figure alone. Of course, in the Kitchen Table series, you see another image of him, but it's with this a child at the table and with a woman at the table. So clearly, this domestic setup. So this image is kind of a bit of an outlier, but I love it. And this is the exhibition. So it was called Everyday People. It was also a nod to the family of man and to thinking back to an historical exhibition at MoMA. Was it Steichen?
Yes.
I think it was Steichen. To think about how we have used art and photography even more so at times as a way to have a conversation that is anthropological as much as it is aesthetically based. And it's amazing to see the images and to hear about how you have these experiences in so many different places. Because I guess, when we first met, it was a different type of anthropology. It was much more localized. And I didn't realize the depth of how much was behind the scene in the more recent work. So it's amazing to see. Also, that idea of the decisive moment, which I thought was not so much a part of your work, but clearly is. And you being able to say, to be able to get the right image, having to go home and come back and redo the whole thing all over again is incredible. The decisive moment, of course, Cartier-Bresson used the decisive moment as a way of talking about his images and as a way of it being based on time and of capturing that exact moment. So at the Menil collection, a collection that has, was built by John and Dominique de Menil, who came to Houston because of their relationship to the Schlumberger family in the 1940s, leaving Europe. They were very, very, very close friends with Cartier-Bresson, with Max Ernst, with René Magritte, etc., and ended up doing a huge portfolio with Cartier-Bresson in Houston, where he's shooting things like rodeos and stuff. It's hilarious. But that was, in order to think about photography there, we had to think about Cartier-Bresson and the decisive moment. And so I started off with a wall of solely Cartier-Bresson images, and there were probably like 100 of them in the entire collection. It was obviously weighted to that European presence and past. Behind that wall was an entire wall of works by Deana Lawson, whose exhibition I believe is still up at the Whitney right now. And that was kind of like the push-pull American counterpart, and brought us up to date, brought us at least through the 60s, some images from the early 70s, and you get a real sense of America versus the European past that was so important to us. So I think that's it. I just wanted to, get through those.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through that. I have one question maybe for the both of you, and then if we have time, we can take a few questions. I'm thinking about you can answer this to each of your own ways, but how is photography responding to our social concerns now? And Deana, I don't see your work as politically motivated, but in your interviews and the way you discuss your work, you're really talking about affirmation of the body, of working class spaces, of identities that are sometimes not given a lot of privilege in contemporary art or in the media. I mean, are you thinking a lot about social consciousness in your work, or is it a kind of leitmotif as you're making projects, as you're making photographs?
I'm definitely thinking about social consciousness. I think overall, going back to the beginning of why I wanted to make pictures, why I choose the people that I do, is a profound affinity, respect of the black body, like this affirmation, or I guess of the sacredness of the black body. When I say black body, it's shorthand for people in my community who I grew up around, who I love, who are family. And, you know, images, you know, are very powerful, photographs in particular. And there's something, you know, yeah, I guess the reason why I became a photographer as opposed to, you know, say an autographic artist that uses their hand to make works, be it painting or sculpture, is there's this direct, you know, sort of recording, obviously thinking about, you know, the history of photography, but there is just something mysterious, I guess, and also maybe even a little dangerous about photography that I really love to play around with, so.
Thank you. And Franklin, in your work as a curator, how have social concerns influenced you? And maybe now that you're a museum director, are you thinking about exhibitions that are responding to our culture and our moment in time politically in photography and other media?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like, you know, part of our job as a museum that's dedicated to contemporary art, a museum that also has, I think, a duty to present the best of Latin America and the Caribbean in particular, that we can't, you know, we think about it every day. And it's not, it's a big conversation. It happens with our board members. Some of them are here. It happens with our amazing curatorial team led by Tobias Ostrander, Diana Nawi, who's done the installations around us, and others. And so with that curatorial team, you know, we're thinking about ways that as a 21st century museum that has a specific civic mandate, right? We're paid for by our community, that we should be able to talk about these things. And so, for instance, you know, Deana's work plays a vital role within that conversation. So yeah, it's absolutely, it's paramount.
Yeah, thank you for that. Emily, do we have time for a few questions? Okay, some engagement. Does anyone have a question for Deana or for Franklin?
Hi. I had a couple of questions. First for Deana, could you talk a little bit about your relationship between you and your sketcher and you and your models, like in terms of compensation, or how is that interaction? It comes to my mind, Helmut Newton, for example, he didn't pay to his models. He would give just a print, $80,000 print, but a print. And for Franklin, if you could talk about the photography and the art collection in a world that is infinite dissemination on the internet, and also the intersection between Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latino photographers or artists.
So that is. Okay, so I'll answer you and then I'll let Franklin. The relationship between me and the sketcher, he is my child's father. He's a painter. He went to Yale University for painting, and he also has a background in engineering, so he's very meticulous. And I think the reason why I work so slow and I'm so specific about lighting, printing, I print all of my work, color, skin tone, is because of him. So my child's father is the person who makes the sketches. And my relationships to the models, initially I started out, I would exchange a print or I would offer a low fee. And now I pay between $75 to $100, $50 to $100 per photo shoot, depending on what's being asked of the model. And they sign a model release.
I try to think about the first part, about how we consider photography within the collection, in a broad sense. So having, we try to build off of what we are. So we have this foundation. Obviously, it came from a very specific place and relates to a lot of early work. So there was an Arbus in there. There was Lee Friedlander was in there. We have a large collection of works by Sid. Why am I forgetting his name? Sid. Help me out. No? Okay. He was an amazing photographer of documentary images, but he was also an absolute political activist, and this is like 1940s, 50s, and he was persecuted. So his work functioned in that way. So we have this foundation from which to jump off of. So then I'll tell you, the most recent photograph we acquired was a photograph by Taryn Simon, right? So it's a still life at its heart, but it's also a very conceptual image in that it does use a text panel to explain to you that this was the floral arrangement that was used when a major international treaty was signed. Right, so it's this, so we're trying to jump off of the foundation we have, but also to think in a way that answers some of those questions about how we see the work functioning in society.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you for your talk. This question's for Deana. I love seeing the images of very powerful, empowered Black women, but I'm also wondering, how do you balance this look of these Black women being empowered, but also not being exoticized at the same time? How do you grapple with that? How do you consider it?
That's a great question, and I think part of the work directly plays with stereotypes instead of tries to hide away from them. So, and also the fact that I'm drawn, or I desire nudity as well, or like I have a certain, just my own personal like aesthetic, like I have an affinity for the nude body. And a lot of the magazines I would look at maybe 5 years ago were Black male soft porn magazines like Smooth Girl or King Magazine. So I know that was certainly like part of like my subconscious when I was making a lot of the nude photographs. But then you have something like Baby Sleep. It'd be one thing if it was just the man and a woman in that room, but you put a baby in there, it just changes everything. Like you would never see that in Smooth Girl. It like will totally interrupt like male satisfaction. So it's like, I think context is also super important. Like you might see one image like Sharon at the very beginning that definitely like is going towards that stereotype, but then you see it next to Garden of Eden, and then I feel like the multiples like start to stretch meaning and the dimensions in different ways.
You've also done that with age and in the choice of certain models that you might not think, okay, I'm going to see this woman as a nude.
Right, that's true. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I get the whole, I'm 46, about to be 47. And I find beauty in Black women a beautiful thing. I hate the fact that Black women are viewed now in a younger generation as stereotype beautiful, but I think beauty should be found in every ethnicity, every generation, and I find her exotic, and I think that's okay. And so my question to you is, how do you find that beauty and make it acceptable? Because I'm okay with her being beautiful and exotic.
That's my foundation too. Like I don't actually understand your question, because that's the.
My question, because she was focusing on being a stereotype, and I hate the fact that when you show beauty as a Black person, it's considered a stereotype than versus accepting that as beauty. Does that make sense to you?
That's true, and also I think also too, like I feel where she's coming from, because as a young woman also looking into photography, like I was definitely shown images of ethnographic photographs that did exotify the Black body in a negative way and create certain stereotypes. I was thinking about like Sarji Bartman and how her body was on display. Like so, it actually took me a while to just say, you know what, like, F that. Like, I'm going to make the images that I want to make. I don't care what baggage, what history. To me, it's just like walking in the fire as opposed to avoiding it. But yeah, I'm sure I mean, it's different, though. It's a different sort of history, like a sort of value, or like I would even say the politics of beauty, you know, and capital in this, you know, culture in terms of white beauty and black beauty is just very different. So kind of not the same, I would say. But
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you. This question is for Deana as well. I remember earlier you talked about this particular image and how the tiger image and the plastic on the couch was like what your mother had in her basement. And so what I wanted to know was, do you find that outside of what is directly available to the viewer, that there are underlying conversations that you're having in your work? And if so, what are some of those conversations?
I don't know what those conversations are, but yes, I do feel like there are underlying conversations happening, and it depends on the audience. I feel like there's certain references like that perhaps a black audience might get quicker than if it's in a different context. Yeah, I guess I would say that. Yeah. I mean, actually, just even to expand upon that, there have been times where people have seen my photographs, say, in like New York, and then I go to Haiti, and they're like, oh, that looks like my cousin, or oh, that looks like it is actually really familiar to them, where they actually feel like they know that person, but they've never met them in their life. But there's something so familiar about the way that the picture is taken in the domestic spaces that I think it is like a recognition that goes beyond surface.
I just want to jump in and add one thing about the question of exoticizing the body. In the conversations that Deana and I had about making this book together, one of the words that she's often used is a gem, and she wants the images to be beautifully presented and to really affirm the subjects and the spaces. And I think there's something that we're talking about a woman photographer, a woman behind the lens, powerfully making images. And when you see those images on the wall of the Whitney or the Art Institute, there is a power within that I think is you totally own that. Would you
It's
agree?
like where you started, though. Her gaze is totally different. I feel like I have to mention in light of that question, is that the issue that you raise is being contested right now in St. Louis at an exhibition. I'm not even going to mention the artist, but this is what we're talking about, and that's a completely different gaze, and it's a question of permission.
You know, looking at this photograph, I almost don't notice the nudity. I'm looking at the composition and the lines and the triangle and so on. And you've said that many of your photographs are sketched in advance. And I was just wondering, to what extent do you consider yourself sort of an artist, if I can use that, different from a photographer or a photographer? If photography is more the tool for the vision, and just how you view the two.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I'm an artist first, or I often refer to myself as a photo-based artist, but to me, the tool that most fit, with this content to me was the camera and not the paintbrush but at the same time, I made certain choices of how I want to position myself as an artist, apart from, just a photographer. But at the same time, I don't mind being called a photographer. Like, one of my greatest mentors, Luis Mendez, who stands at the corner of B&H on 34th Street with a speed graphic camera, and who taught me so much about lighting and particularly photographing the black body, and how photographing black folks is different than photographing white people, how you have to light it different, might have to put a color gel on this and that. So like, I kind of like the tools and like the bells and whistles of a photographer, but at the same time, I feel like, the psychological, formal elements more so live in the world of art.
We're going to take one more. 2 more.
Thank you.
Hi. Hi, I'm right here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought. Okay.
Oh, sorry. I'm right here. I think in many of our dialogue or conversation in our world, Asian Americans' voice is missing. So I don't know. As you can tell, not only I'm Asian American, I'm also immigrant American. So I think that part of the voice seems completely ignored. So I don't know why. And also, as a minority artist, do you have any suggestion or any reminder to the art world that Asian American also need to be noticed, be paid attention to, because we have our issue. There's injustice for Asian American as well. So why don't we pay a little bit more attention to Asian American and Asian American artists? Thank you.
Do you want to take this one? Well, I'll just say I just want to respond to that in a somewhat general way in the context of a recent issue of Aperture, the summer issue, which is called Vision and Justice, edited by Sarah Lewis. And in that issue, there's a fantastic interview with Ava DuVernay, who's the award-winning director of Selma, among other films. And recently, Ava has said in interviews that she hates the word diversity because it's not about ticking off boxes. The word is inclusion. And I would also add the word invitation, because I think that we need to. We're not talking about diversity because we want to win prizes. We're talking about inclusion because we're talking about great artists. So I personally don't know what the solution is in terms of increasing visibility for Asian American artists, but I think that institutionally, and I think Franklin would agree, and you can, if you want to jump in, that we have to stress the idea of a plural society that we live in and look carefully at all of the voices in our artistic community and make sure we're really advancing what we see on the streets, into the spaces of the museum and in publications. Thank you very much. I take your point, and I'm glad you brought that part of the conversation today. So,
okay. I mean, this is also for Carrie, for Deana, I'm sorry, which is you mentioned how vital the pose is to your work, and it's so clear from these photographs that in a lot of cases, I guess on nearly all cases, you're using non-professional models. It's so clear that you have a strong rapport and relationship with them. I guess that's often developed very, very quickly. If you could talk about how you go about sort of doing that. It seems like you have a game plan, but how do you bring them into it and to be so present?
It certainly varies from subject to subject, but one thing I notice, most subjects initially are nervous and their shoulders are, I just say relax your shoulders. And I think that's the number one, like if you're a photographer and you're photographing people, relax your shoulders. And then it really is about this game or this eye contact between me and the subject. Like if you ever watch the documentary of Richard Avedon, like how he's like really scanning like the subject, almost like psychically scanning. Like, I don't know, I don't have that power, but I'm definitely trying to, I don't know how to describe it, but it's something that happens in the moment, and yeah.
You have a gift, I think. We could just put it that way.
Okay. I hope that answers your question.
Is there one more question? Yeah.
We might as well.
So, thank you for your talk. I think there were some questions around kind of the exoticizing kind of women and whatnot, and I wanted to kind of know when you go into different places, like the places that that I've seen in your work, like Ethiopia, Jamaica, Haiti, they're very kind of particular, and the Congo, or DR Congo, in terms of, I think, people's knowledge of Africa and the West Indies. There are very particular places that occupy, I feel like, a Western imaginary. So what are the the ways that you maybe carefully kind of work within those spaces to not kind of, I mean, you have a particular gaze that's going to be different than others, and so how do you, I don't know if I'm phrasing this well, but kind of have real attention and concern for the space that you're going to, particularly those spaces because of the way that they are known within the larger diaspora, the way that maybe other Caribbean islands and African countries are not kind of thought of.
Right. With DR Congo, you know, I read Joseph Conrad's like The Heart of Darkness, and like, you know, I definitely felt like it was like pictured as this hell on earth, you know. And really, the garden is for, you know, those paintings that you see on the sidewalks of like Brooklyn or Harlem, like that can really romantic. Like, the garden is actually for that audience. It's actually up right now at the Underground Museum in LA. And a man who had just gotten out of prison, he was a part of the Crips. When he saw that photograph, he's like, this is the truth right here. You know, and I just felt like I did something right, because I'm portraying it like, you know, in opposition to what the Western imaginary has, you know, created it to be. I do feel like by intuition and also like just moving in the way that I do, like organically meeting people, like it actually did turn out to be a different idea of what, you know, the Congo is, or what it was actually. It's just like, you know, DR Congo is one of the greatest places of coltan. Like literally the land is rich, and yet, you know, it's like so much poverty and crisis, and it's just like, no, this is royalty. Like, you know, this, my imagination is what was before colonialism? Like, what could it, you know, what was that space? And I often feel like, you know, artists, particularly black artists, have to like stop at colonialism when they're creating work in terms of like their imagination. Is just like, nah, like F colonialism for a minute. Like, let me just like put that aside and say like, you know, how about, you know, I could be as like romantic and nostalgic as I want to be as an African American woman about this space. And nobody can, you know, like, so that was a part of it. And then also like with Ethiopia, you know, it was one of the only countries that wasn't colonized by the Europeans. And like, you know, Haile Selassie is considered almost a god to Jamaicans in Rastafari culture. The day it rained when he came to Jamaica, they thought like, wow, you know, like this man is truly a god, and he's like only maybe 5 feet tall. And you see him in pictures next to lions and tigers, you know, it's just like, wow. So just thinking about that whole majesty and, you know, empresses and emperors, and it's just a different idea of black royalty that I wanted to project.
So thank you so much. Thanks to Emily and Stephanie, Deana, and Franklin. Yeah.